I'd like to start off with a little bit of OSHA news. This has to do with the electronic submittal of OSHA logs. OSHA's final rule on improved tracking of workplace injuries and illnesses is now in full effect. Who does it affect? Establishments with 20 plus employees that are classified in certain industries, including construction. There are many states on state approved plans that are not affected by this standard. That includes California, Maryland, Minnesota, South Carolina, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. So any establishments with 250 or more employees must electronically submit information from OSHA forms 300, 300A, and 301. And establishments with 20 to 249 employees must electronically submit the information on their 300A form. So these are all going to be due on December 1st, 2007. The website is available. It is up and running now. The website you can go to is osha.gov/injury reporting/. There's a button on the top right-hand corner that says Launch ITA. This will allow you to create a login for your company and submit your OSHA logs for that year. Please don't wait till November. If everybody tries to get it in the last 2 weeks, I'm sure the website will fail, and that will not limit you from your responsibility to have put it in. Now on to the Silica standard. Okay, do you remember this slide from last time we had a safety advisory meeting? OSHA delayed its enforcement. It was originally supposed to happen in June 23rd of 2007. Now it happened on Saturday. We asked you not to push off your compliance activities because there's a lot to comply with this one. The old standard was about half a page buried in subpart Z of the OSHA regulations. The new standard is 30 pages long. And in the old standard, there was 250 micrograms per cubic meter was where your permissible exposure level was at. Well, they've taken that down to 50 micrograms per cubic meter. It's important not only for the health of your employees, but because OSHA has changed their citation amounts as well. It used to be $7,000 maximum for a serious citation. That was pretty much from the inception of OSHA until last year. They've now raised it up to $12,765. A repeated or willful, which used to have a maximum penalty of $70,000, is now $126,749. And the rates now adjust every year for inflation. So if the welfare of your employees is not the driving force, we know financially, OSHA is enforcing this with a big stick. Okay, so let's get down to what the standard entails. Okay, 1926.1153 applies to all occupational exposures to respirable silica in construction work. There is an exception where employees' exposure will remain below the action level under any foreseeable conditions. Okay, the action level means the concentration of airborne crystalline silica that's respirable of 25 micrograms per cubic meter, as calculated on an 8-hour time-weighted average. The permissible exposure level, which is the level you cannot submit your employees beyond, is 50 micrograms per cubic meter, calculated on an 8-hour time-weighted average. So this standard has many different aspects of compliance. Competent person, exposure assessment to determine how much silica exposure is happening, specified exposure control methods, including Table 1, which is a list of 18 common tasks that create silica dust that can be taken care of by following the specific exposure controls stated in Table 1. There's also, in addition, a need for written exposure control plans and in some cases, medical surveillance, and in all cases, record keeping. Okay, so let's move on to competent person. This is not a new concept. Competent person is a definition that's used often in OSHA regulations. It's one who is capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions which are unsanitary, hazardous, or dangerous to employees. They must also have the authorization to make prompt corrective measures to eliminate them. Now, specifically to the Silica competent person, there's an additional statement added to the definition. The Silica competent person must have the knowledge and ability necessary to make frequent and regular inspections of job sites, materials, and equipment to implement the written exposure control plan. So exposure assessment is one of the big parts of this standard. The employer must assess the exposure of each employee who is or may reasonably be expected to be exposed to respirable crystalline silica at or above the action level. And OSHA is going to give us two options for handling that: the performance option and the scheduled monitoring option. The performance option states that the employer shall assess 8-hour time-weighted average exposure for each employee on the basis of any combination of air monitoring data or objective data sufficient to accurately characterize employee exposures to respirable crystalline silica. That is a tongue twister, I'll tell you that. Examples of objective data could be air monitoring data from industry-wide surveys, calculations based on the composition of the substance being used, area sampling results and exposure mapping profile approaches, and historic air monitoring data. The second option is scheduled monitoring option. In this option, you'll personal breathing zone air samples reflecting the exposures of employees on each shift for each job classification in each work area for a representative fraction of the employees. A representative fraction of the employees in most cases is 20%. If the initial monitoring shows less than the action level, then you can discontinue monitoring. If it is at the action level and less than the PEL, you need to repeat the monitoring every 6 months until it drops below the action level. And if it is at or above the PEL, you must repeat the monitoring every 3 months. During this monitoring, if 2 consecutive exposure monitoring results drop below the action level, then you can discontinue. But they have to be within 6 months of each other, but no more than 7 days apart. Whenever there's a change in production, process, control, equipment, or work practices, exposure monitoring must be conducted. So if there is an exposure assessment, you need to notify each affected employee in writing of the assessment results within 5 working days after receiving the laboratory results. If the exposure is above the PEL, you need to provide written notification of the corrective actions that are going to be used to reduce it below the PEL. One of the big statements in this standard is that you cannot just throw somebody into a respirator to protect them from silica. Okay, there must be the use of engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain exposures below the PEL. You can't just rely on the respirator. The exception is when the employer can demonstrate that controls are not feasible. Stating that it's not feasible is not the same as demonstrating that it's not feasible. OSHA is going to look for an example that you have tried to do it and have not been able to. And it does not work with your business model. If all feasible controls are not sufficient to reduce the exposure below the PEL, then you must still reduce the exposure to the lowest feasible level and then implement your respiratory protection program. There are 18 tasks on Table 1. What Table 1 is these 18 tasks. OSHA has specified if you follow the exposure controls that they've defined within this table, then you do not need to do air monitoring. You do not need to do assessment. Okay, so each of these 18 tasks, and I believe I only have 13 on here. The last 5 have to do with street work and asphalt. But these 13 tasks, it'll state for each of them what controls need to be used, and then whether or not respiratory protection is required. And it divides it into less than 4 hours in a shift, more than 4 hours a shift, and it also divides it between inside and outside. Okay, so I do have an example of this coming up in a couple of slides. So the tasks on Table 1 would be stationary masonry saws, handheld power saws for cutting fiber cement board with a blade of 8-inch diameter or less, walk behind saws, drivable saws, rig mounted core saws, dowel rigging rigs, handheld and stand mounted drills, vehicle mounted drills, jackhammers, handheld grinders for removing mortar, and handheld grinders for other than mortar removal, and walk behind milling machines and floor grinders. So on that table, it'll specify whether respiratory protection is required. So respiratory protection is required where it's specified in that table, or if you're not following Table 1, when you're over the PEL and still implementing engineering and work practice controls, or when all feasible engineering and work practice controls are in place and exposure is still over PEL. You must have a compliant respiratory protection program in order to wear the respirators. And that means running the full gambit: fit tests, medical evaluation, medical clearance, and respirator training. So here's an example of Table 1. Table 1 has a specific exposure control for handheld and stand mounted drills when drilling into something that contains silica. Okay, the engineering and work practice control methods: you need to use a drill equipped with commercially available shroud or cowling with dust collection system. You need to operate and maintain the tool in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. The dust collector must provide airflow recommended by the tool manufacturer or greater, and have a filter with 99% efficiency and a filter cleaning mechanism. And you need to use a HEPA filtered vacuum when cleaning the holes. Okay, if you follow those engineering and work practice control methods, and you have that task being performed by a person for less than 4 hours a shift, then there is no need of a respirator. If you're doing it for more than 4 hours a shift, there's also no need for a respirator. But you do need to follow the engineering and work practice controls. Now, if you were utilizing a drill without these work practice controls, then you would not be complying with Table 1. That's still acceptable, but then you're going to need to do the exposure assessment to make sure that they are not over the action level or permissible exposure level while doing that task. All employers covered by this standard, including employers who are fully and properly implement the specific exposure controls in Table 1, must develop and implement a written exposure control plan. What that means is there's a specific document called a written exposure control plan. It can be created in any format, but it needs to have a specific list of things on it. And that needs to be written up and on site every time there is a silica exposure. It can be a generic one that covers a specific task at most sites, but the competent person needs to have the authority and the ability to alter that written exposure control plan to meet what is happening on the site. Okay, the written exposure control plan is required for all tasks that involve exposure to silica. And it must include the following information: a description of the task, the engineering controls being used, the work practices being used, what respiratory protection is being used, what housekeeping measures are being used to keep the silica down, and procedures to restrict the access to work areas where the silica exposure is happening. This is the example that OSHA gives in its small entity compliance guide for the silica standard. This is the written exposure control plan that they show as an example. You can see here it has the company name, the person completing the plan, description of the task, the controls and work practices, then what respiratory protection is utilized, what housekeeping is utilized, and then the procedures used to restrict access to the work areas. Okay, so in this one, they schedule the work so that only employees who are engaged in the task, the jackhammer operator and employees helping the operator, are in the area. So the next issue on this standard is medical surveillance. So the big question is, who requires medical surveillance? Each employee that's required to use a respiratory for protection from silica exposure for 30 or more days per year needs to be enrolled in a medical surveillance program. Needs to be available to them at no cost to the employee, at a reasonable time and place, and needs to be performed by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional. This medical surveillance is required. You need a baseline medical exam within 30 days of the initial assessment, initial assignment, and then at least every 3 years, and more frequently if the physician or other licensed healthcare professional requires it. There are other considerations as far as medical surveillance. OSHA specifies pretty clearly what that exam needs to entail. It entails a chest x-ray to see if silicosis has started in the lungs, physical exam, a pulmonary test. So there is a lot of compliance there as far as the medical surveillance. The record-keeping aspect of this standard states you need to maintain accurate records. And this is very important for the silica standard, especially if OSHA just come along, for you to be able to show that this is not a willful or repeated incident. You need to maintain accurate records. Air monitoring data, specifically dates, tasks, sampling and analytical methods, the number, duration, and results of the samples, the labs used, what PPE was worn by the employees while they were being tested, the employee names, social security names or numbers, and job classifications. Objective data, specifically like silica-containing material, source of objective data, testing protocol and results, description and other data relevant to the process, task, or activity. And this is if you are able to find an objective data source that can say, doing this task, you are not above the action level for a specific task. Medical surveillance, specifically each employee name and social security number, copy of the physician or licensed healthcare professional and specialist written opinions, copy of info provided to that physician and any specialists. All the records need to be maintained and made available to OSHA in accordance with 1910-.220 or 1020. The employee exposure records must be preserved and maintained for at least 30 years. And employee medical records for each employee must be preserved and maintained for at least a duration of 30 years past employment. So that is, in a nutshell, what the standard requirements of this Silica standard is. You need to have a competent person, someone who is knowledgeable about the Silica standard, about being able to assess hazards and recognize them, and has the authority to do something to stop it, to change it, and mitigate those hazards. They also need to have the knowledge and ability to be able to alter a written exposure control plan on site when it is necessary. There's the exposure assessment to determine whether or not the silica exposure is above the PEL or action level stated in the standard. Specifies exposure control methods. We need to start with engineering and work practice and then work our way down to PPE, just like everything else that OSHA states that is the hierarchy that we need to follow. And in this instance, unless it's not feasible, OSHA is going to require you to use engineering and work controls, and then if it's still not mitigated, PPE on top of that. Written exposure control plans, which are required for every silica exposure. Every silica dust creating task needs to have a written exposure control plan if it is going to be at the action level or above. And medical surveillance and record keeping. So I am sure there are a lot of questions at this point. If anybody has any questions, or if there's some discussion on what needs to be done to comply with this standard, and what can be done, what's different strategies for complying with it, now's a good time to ask.
Hi, Mike. This is Bob Weaver. We had a short conversation earlier. Just want to give an update on a couple of things that we're actually doing on our end through FCA. We are currently working with the manufacturer base, collecting some of their testing data that they've had. We're doing this both with our paint manufacturers and our drywall manufacturers. So we've been working on some of these things to try to give us some of the baseline information. One of the questions that I actually have for you, and it was part of your piece, I got cut off for a short period, so you may have already addressed it. But you were talking about where with the exposure level, and you were talking about, I guess it was called performance statistics, whereby they could use third-party data. So would that be considered everything where if the manufacturers come through and say, hey, here's the sanding data for sanding our materials, and this is what the potential exposure is, and if all that stuff falls below the target numbers, does that mean that they could then use that information as part of their I guess historical data or the third-party data?
Yes, that would be part of the performance option. If you can get specific information related to the tasks that the employees are performing, you need to be able to get the information, including what the testing procedure was, what controls were put in place, and make sure that the environment is similar, that not only the task, but where it was performed is a similar situation. So if there was a test done with sanding paint in an exterior situation, in an building exterior, then taking that task and doing it in interior and enclosed space would not be an acceptable apples to apples example of performance option. But it would serve as objective data for doing it outside. So as long as the task and the environment and the tools that are being used are all very similar, then you can use that objective data to comply with the performance option.
Okay, and with that being said, if the data shows that there is not enough respirable crystalline silica to trigger the thing, does that mean that you don't necessarily need to have any kind of a written control plan since the activity does not trigger? Or does it still require a written control plan because potentially it could?
This statement here comes straight from OSHA, and it states that all employees covered by the standard, which are all employees that create silica dust, regardless of whether it is above the action level or permissible exposure level. But all employers who create silica dust, who create that exposure, need to have a written exposure control plan. So I would say that yes, even with that data, a written exposure control plan would still need to be on site.
Only if you actually are doing a task that's on table 1, correct?
No. Table 1 is, what table 1 does is it gives you 18 tasks that you do not need to do assessments. You do not need to assess the exposure as long as you follow the controls that they have laid out. Anything not on table 1 requires the assessment, requires the exposure assessment either through air monitoring or historical data or objective data to show that they are not above that exposure level. Even if,
and that requires, so that's still going to require, so for example, if our drywall contractors who are doing sanding on a project where potentially there could be silica exposure, and the historical data and the data we're getting from the manufacturers shows that they won't hit the trigger level, they're still going to need an exposure control plan for sanding?
correct. And the written exposure control plan it's a very simple document, especially when you're working with a silica exposure that you know is below the action level. You can write that written exposure control plan as long as it covers the 6 items that's required on that control plan, then you're covered. So what could be done in that situation for a contractor that was taking on that task is they could create one written exposure control plan for that task and put it in a book and put it with all of their foremen. It's not one that needs to be individually tailored to each site in the office.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
If you have a more complex one that you're going to be triggering your action level and your permissible exposure level, you're going to want to make sure that that competent person is taking into account any differences on this site from other sites and possibly altering that written exposure control plan, whether in how they're restricting access to that area or what the different methods for getting ventilation, airflow through, or whatever controls they are using to help limit that exposure.
Interesting. This is going to be a lot of fun, I can see.
Yeah, it's a challenging topic right now, and at this point in time, we have not yet seen how OSHA is going to be enforcing it. But we do know how the standard is written, and how it's written is pretty strict. There's a lot of different moving parts to it.
Does OSHA have a template for the written control plan?
They do not have a template, but they do have this example that's on the screen now. There is what is called a small entity compliance guide for the Silica standard. It's a publication that OSHA has put out, and it includes this written exposure control plan as a sample written exposure control plan. This written exposure control plan is for one of the tasks on Table 18, but you could easily write one like this for any task.
Sounds like that'll be a good template for us to work on, put together. So, and
there is a lot of good information in that small entity compliance guide. And if I would suggest that people in charge of safety and the contractors of the FCA definitely take a look at that.
Very good. Very good.
This is Peter Graham. I have a question, if it's all right to go now.
Not a problem, yes, Peter. Go ahead.
Just a question about sanding drywall. The OSHA had it on Table 1 originally, according to the Federal Register, the 606-page document.
Right.
And they took it off of Table 1, and basically, from the reasons, was because NIOSH did some testing of something like 6 commercially available joint compounds, and their test results came out that on, I think it was either all the tests or all but one, pole sanding overhead, directly overhead or something, they were all below the new PEL. And I'm just wondering why we can't use, or if anyone knows, why we can't just use the Federal Register information of the NIOSH testing and as our objective data and not have to do anything. They also cite in there that NIOSH found that most silica most joint compounds are silica free or low silica content. They don't define what that is. Like if it's less than 1% silica content by weight, it's silica free. That sounds like what they're getting at. But it's just, it strikes me as odd is that they had it on Table 1 and then they took it off of Table 1 because it seems like NIOSH and OSHA are saying it's not a hazard. So I don't know if anybody else has any information on that. Like, do us drywall contractors, sanding contractors even have to do anything at this point?
Well, Peter, I was not aware of the NIOSH data and that being pulled off of Table 1. If NIOSH has that data, I don't see why that data cannot be used as an objective data source. As to touch on your silica-free joint compound issue, you are always allowed to look at the SDSs for the material that you're using. If you're using a drywall compound, taping compound that does not have silica on its SDS, then your silica exposure is not existent.
Yeah, and that was one of my things. I did on the OSHA website, there's an email submit button on their in their silica area, whatever you want to call it. And I submitted and I said, hey, I talked to them about, in my question about the Federal Register, saying there's all this silica-free joint compound out there. And the problem is I can't find any silica-free anywhere in the world. So I'm just wondering where they find it, and then they never replied. Most of them are low silica.
Hey, Peter?
Yeah.
I'm actually out at the Drywall Finishing Council meeting here in Las Vegas. We had a pretty extensive conversation about this morning.
Yeah.
Apparently, all joint compounds have some silica in there because it's actually some of the natural occurring stuff that's part of the raw materials, such as the limestone, the mica, the clay, and those things that are in there.
Yeah.
So it's somewhere between 1% and 3% is the total amount of silica that is part of all joint compounds. And they were talking about the some of the NIOSH stuff, including the concept that 1 in 6 of those, failed the thing. And it was kind of interesting because also as part of that, they showed the engineering controls of, obviously, zero control sanding by hand, a 60% control sanding with a sanding pole, which I kind of questioned, but they were basically saying that it had some control because the operator was away from the dust at least 4 feet, the length of the pole, and that it gave the opportunity for that stuff to fall to the ground. And then they showed, obviously, the vacuum systems, which were very, very good. But what they talked about there was OSHA at this point is still requiring all our drywall contractors to go through the air monitoring process and all that stuff that goes with it, which is why we're looking to grab and capture the data, not only from the NIOSH stuff, which we did find on one of the files, but also the data from our manufacturers, because if we can get each of the manufacturers to have the backup stuff to go with that along with the NIOSH, along with some of the other third-party industry stuff, should be enough for us to get beyond a bunch of these issues.
I'm sorry, what was your name, sir?
It's Bob Weaver.
Oh, Bob.
I'm the Eastern guy.
Okay. Hey, Bob, if you or if anybody on this call happens to get those like testing documents, exposure assessment documents from manufacturers, is there a way to share them with all of us?
We will absolutely be doing that. That's part of the plan with FCA.
Awesome.
Bring the information together. Even down to we were looking at potentially, if totally necessary, would we be able to do some kind of a testing piece, on parts of this, through FCA. So we are doing that, but we think we have enough information from one of our technical groups out west, and then coming in from the manufacturers that we believe by the end of the week we should have enough information. But we're looking to share this information with everybody, and the first part of it should be ready by the end of the week.
Cool.
That's all I have, Michael.
All right. Are there any other questions on the table? I know there's always questions as to what materials hold silica. It's very common throughout most minerals in the earth. So whenever we're dealing with stone, crushed rock, mortar, there's silica in many paints. There's silica in taping compound, as we discussed. SDSs are a good guide as to whether or not a material has silica in it or not. Are there any other tasks that anybody has questions on outside of tasks on table 1?
Mike, this is Dan Bloom with Service Trial and Decorating. I got in late on this. You had mentioned about the 6 items that are covered when your products are under the exposure that OSHA requires. What are those 6 items?
Let me get it to there. The written exposure control plan needs to have the following items on the written exposure control plan. It needs to have a description of task, the engineering controls, work practices, respiratory protection that will be required, what housekeeping measures will be used to keep the exposure to a minimum, and what procedures to resist access to the work areas for those who aren't working in it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
One more question.
Yep.
Yeah, are we going to be have this PowerPoint made available to us? This is Don Wentler calling.
Ooh.
Don, I believe that we're going to be saving this, or videoing this and saving it as a webinar. Is that correct?
Yeah, no doubt. Don, we can get it to you for sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Common tasks that I know are a concern are sweeping, drywall dust compound, and just general sweeping around on construction sites. Those are going to require engineering controls and work practices, such as sweeping compound and a written exposure control plan. There's a lot of different aspects to consider for this. Has anybody used any tools that they found to be effective to minimize the exposures? I know when I was talking to Bob yesterday, we were speaking about the vacuum rigs set up to sanding drywall.
Yeah, the dustless sanding rigs are that was one of the controls they did a testing on, and you know, NIOSH said that it took a 95% cost and all. I guess that really goes into, I guess, another question that's sort of going to be on the back side of this, Mike. You know, we're talking about the silica piece right now, but in my research of really digging deep into this, I found that the dust exposure level from sanding is probably going to become more critical for our drywall contractors than even the silica is going to be. And it just seems like they haven't really talked too much about that. And those levels seem like they're pretty low. Have you heard anything about, you know, the enforcement of the current dust rules?
No, I haven't. As I'm sure many of you know, there are many regulations written into OSHA that are not commonly enforced. And I think a lot of it has to do with awareness and also, you know, hierarchy and severity of different situations and what OSHA investigates.
Well, that'll certainly do it.
Well, and this may bring that to light as well and bring increased enforcing of that standard as well.
This is Jared from Niehaus Building Services in St. Louis.
Hi, Jerry.
The information about the nuisance dust is exactly correct. We have objective data from USG that states that you will reach the PEL for nuisance dust long before you reach the PEL of respirable silica.
Okay. Well, that is definitely very good information. In that case, if we're going to exceed the PEL for nuisance dust, was the statement that the tasks do indeed exceed the PEL for nuisance dust?
That's a great question. I actually would like to pull that up and just review it quickly. Stand by.
Okay, thank you. In that type situation where there is silica dust, a silica exposure, but we are wearing respirators primarily for nuisance dust, it still may very well trigger the medical surveillance requirements if the silica dust is above the action level or PEL, or above the PEL, not the action level. And does everyone understand the difference between the action level at which it becomes an issue with silica and the permissible exposure level where you are not allowed to expose your employees to without protection?
I think that's one of those questions that is very difficult to answer, because I don't think anybody really knows what 25 or 50 micrograms looks like.
Okay, well, I can go into that discussion a little bit. I do this sometimes when I do silica trainings. If you take a packet of equal or sugar and you divide that packet in half 16 times, that's about where you're at. I've never been able to divide it 16 times. The closest I've come, I think, is 12 before you're not dealing with anything. And by that time, you're looking at a grain or 2 grains. And that's well above the permissible exposure level.
Hey, Mike, this is Jared again. I've had a chance to review that.
Great.
It states that the time-weighted average for total dust exposure is greater than 70% below the PEL.
Okay. So 70% below the PEL for nuisance dust is 70% below the PEL, and there's more nuisance dust than there is silica dust. We might have the start of objective data to get there. I don't think that's enough to prove that there's not a silica exposure, since it doesn't test directly silica exposure. But I think it's the start of that data and getting it together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have right now, is that we don't have the data put together. We haven't had many people go out and do the assessments to find out whether or not they're above the action level, above the permissible exposure level, and gotten that information to us so that we can get it out.
So does that mean that if we do the testing, that becomes our objective data?
As far as historical data goes, historical data for OSHA, generally, as long as the situation is the same, you're using the same tools, the same process, same materials in a very similar situation, you can use that as historical data. It would take more than one company's historical data to allow it to be used, I believe, for an industry.
But it could be used specifically for that. In terms of getting started, to comply, we could use that first set of data as the beginning of putting together a historical data set then?
If you were to perform the initial assessment on the scheduled exposure assessment, if you could compile multiple examples of that, then you would have the historical data. Because it also states that if you can reasonably assume you're going to be underneath the action level in a certain task that creates exposure, then you do not need to use it. The small entity compliance guide specifies one task that they feel is below the action level for silica creation is using a drill to drill holes in concrete less than 15 minutes a shift. They say you can reasonably assume that there is not a exposure of silica above the action level. The difficulty with those statements is that OSHA gets to decide what's reasonable to assume and what's not. And until we find out how they are enforcing it, we won't know.
All right, Michael, it sounds like we've just about covered everything we can on this for today, unless someone else has another question.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for their time, and I appreciate you guys listening to me. Good questions.